What's up, everybody? Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I am going solo today because my comrade and co-host, Misty Winston, is taking care of a migraine. But nonetheless, I'm happy to welcome back Morgan Artyukhina. They are a writer with Sputnik, and today we're going to be talking about something we've talked about before, but sort of picking up where we left off, if you will. And that is what's been happening with colonial wars and legacies, Western colonial wars and legacies in Africa. And we're going to start with Western Sahara, which is something we talked about previously, but there have been some developments there, but we'll get into that. And we'll see what happens from there. Morgan, thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Always glad to be back on y'all's show.
So, as I mentioned, Western Sahara, it's something we talked about previously. We talked about it in more of a historical context, but it's been in the news recently with regard to the Biden administration and the Biden administration not outright saying it, but essentially continuing Trump's formal recognition of Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly when I came on y'all's show, if it was December or January or something like, but it was not long after Trump had made that decision back in December 2020 to recognize Morocco's claim to rule over Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco agreeing to normalize relations with Israel as part of the Abraham Accords thing that involved Sudan and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. So it was more of that, of winning support for Israel abroad. And in exchange, Morocco got recognition of its claim that Western Sahara is part of a kind of greater Morocco. That it's a very kind of historically based claim that the Moroccan kingdom was once bigger before European colonialism, and that it was kind of cut off from that. And so they have dreams of kind of a greater Morocco, that extends as far as Mauritania, might include Algeria and stuff. So there's a real kind of, I don't want to call it revanchism, but it's a kind of, they have their own kind of empire building ambitions there. And so, of course, Western Sahara is not an empty territory. There are the native Sahrawi people who live there, who are related to the Amazigh tribes that live across much of the Sahara and Sahel regions. So they've been fighting for their independence since back to Spanish colonial times, and they're continuing to fight now. And of course, Biden became president in January, and there was all kinds of, Trump is gone, Trumpism is gone, and whatever. Now, of course, those of us who are anti-imperialists, who have always been talking about the continuities between administrations, the ways that Trump was similar to Obama, and now the ways that Biden is similar to Trump, because we don't live in a monarchy, where everything is decided by the whims of the person in power. We live in a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist class, and the president is just the supreme executive of that class, managing the common affairs, as Karl Marx put it. So you can really see that in the ways that a lot of policies abroad have been kept the same, and Western Sahara is one of them. Morocco is a kind of client state of the United States, as well as of France, and so, which is of course another U.S. ally, an anchor member of the European Union, and such too. So it's really valuable in many ways to the United States and acts as a kind of regional policeman, especially when you have a third worldist kind of anti-imperialist nation like Algeria next to it, which is more kind of in the Chinese and Russian camp, and supporting independence movement, has supported independence movements across Africa, including the Sahrawi movement in Western Sahara. So after Biden became president, there was a lot of pressure to reverse the decision that Trump made, because it goes against decades of carefully crafted U.S. foreign policy in the region, which included support for self-determination for the Sahrawis, the right to have an independence referendum, whatever it gets decided as, that they should have that. And so, like, a lot of really big name diplomatic figures like John Bolton and former secretaries of state and people like that spoke out vocally and publicly against Trump's move. And so there's been pressure to reverse that on Biden. And yeah, recently we got this comment. Somebody asked the State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, about it. And he basically said, we haven't made a decision yet, but like, we're looking at something that would be mutually acceptable to all. We're talking to all parties and whatever, which really amounts to, like, it sounds like, oh, we're getting there. But what it really amounts to is just kind of keeping it the same. They're not going to go back. And, because they still have the same policy towards Israel. They still have the same policy towards Algeria, towards, other kind of war on terror style fights in Libya and Mali and across, the Sahel region. So there's really not going any reason that they would change. They don't care about continuity or are about, remaining true to principles and whatever. Their principle is U.S. imperialism. And, what that needs in Israel is far more important than a couple of Sahrawis in the desert. So that's kind of what's going on there. Meanwhile, there is this liberation war in Western Sahara going on. So.
And I think what's interesting about that exchange you mentioned, which was between Matt Lee at AP and Ned Price, is that Ned Price insisted repeatedly that there was no continuation with regard to Biden's policy when compared to Trump's policy as pertains Western Sahara. And at the same time, he was saying that there is a continuation. It was almost as if the non-answer or the attempt at denial was, the lens was flipped, and the revelation was made that it is a continuation. And like you said, it's not going to go any different way than it has been going, as we've seen with Israel as well, which the Biden administration pretty much won't even talk about unless it's in a fawning way. So the connection there is interesting, especially with regard to the Abraham Accords, as you mentioned. So speaking of imperialism, there have also been developments in Mali with regard to France's imperial adventures there. And recently, France ended its Operation Barkhane. Can you elaborate on what's going on there?
So Mali used to be a French colony, and it gained independence in 1960, along with most of the other Sahelian nations, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Senegal, all kind of part of this wave of independence that happened as a result of the Algerian War. Of course, Algeria was fighting for its independence at the time, and even as they were fighting for their independence, supporting liberation movements all across Western Africa. And so by 1960, the French government was kind of in a position where they had to renegotiate the status of their empire. And if you remember, in May 1958, Charles de Gaulle came to power at the head of a military coup that destroyed the Fourth Republic. And that coup was initiated by generals in Algeria who wanted a freer hand to fight the National Liberation Front. And so that really weakened kind of the empire's basis, their kind of support. And so they held this referendum in 1960 about like which colonies want to stay a part of the empire and which don't. And I think all of them, all the colonies except for I think Senegal maybe, voted for independence. It was this huge deal. So all those countries got independence like 1960, but they never really were able to cut their colonial ties with France. And when we talk about the era after formal colonialism, we talk about these lasting relationships where you technically have an independent government, but in reality, there are economic, political ties, military dependency in many cases on the former colonial power or on a combination of powers who act on behalf of corporate interests and their own geopolitical interests. And we call that neocolonialism because there is this at least facade of independence. And that's really what has been playing out in Mali and in a lot of these Sahelian countries. This Operation Barkhane is a French kind of war on terror. People call it, it was been called like France's Forever War, basically, that it's the same kind of logic as underpinned the US war on terror. And it really kind of dovetailed with it in a major respect in that this was ostensibly being waged against terrorist groups in the Sahel region, which is this kind of arid, semi-desertous region on the border of the Sahara, where agriculture is possible, but it's also very dry and it's very open and flat. And so France has been fighting them on behalf of and in conjunction with many of these these former colonies, militaries in Chad and Niger and such, in conjunction with them. So there is a relationship there. Barkhane began because of what was happening in Mali. Back in 2012, there was a uprising by another people loosely related to the Sahrawis called the Tuaregs, who live in northern Mali on the edge of the desert and in the desert. And there was a lot of chaos really caused by the destruction of Libya the year before in 2011, which threw the entire region into chaos, created armed groups, dispersion of weapons. There's, opportunities to get money from oil or whatever. And so it created this chaos all across the region and helped to spread many militant groups, some of which might be linked to Daesh or Al Qaeda or whatever, many of which are probably just militias for Muslim communities. And the US and France see terrorism when they see that. Either way, there was this uprising by the Tuaregs, and there was a coup in Mali by the military because they were upset with that the government wasn't doing anything to stop it. The coup created even more chaos, and the Tuaregs took over half the country. And at that point, the new Malian government appealed to France for aid. France sent a force of several thousand troops to Mali. That was called Operation Serval. Operation Serval became Barkhane the following year and expanded into a 5 or 6 nation operation in Burkina Faso, Niger. It was actually headquartered at N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, all across this region, more than 5,000 French troops. And when I say it's like the war on terror, it's like the war on terror in many respects too. I think a great example is that back in January, there was this airstrike on a wedding in Mali. The French Ministry of the Armed Forces has adamantly maintained that this was a strike on a terrorist training camp. 2 Mirage jets bombed this. They said they killed like 50 terrorists, and it came out. The United Nations investigated, and Amnesty investigated. Even locals reported, in the West African press and stuff, that no, this was a wedding. And weddings in Mali the receptions are segregated by gender. So all the men are together, all the women are together at the reception, and they bombed the male section saying, oh, it's a bunch of men in the desert, they must be terrorists.
Right.
And that kind of thing. And so Barkhane has been very unpopular in West Africa. There have been protests, large political movements to end the French occupation, not really an occupation, but the presence of French troops and cooperation with French troops. It's also unpopular back in France too. And I think the thing is, Macron is an adept politician. He had the chance to end Barkhane because of the death of Idris Deby in Chad and because of this coup in Mali that made the situation very unstable. But in reality, he's up for re-election next year, and this war is extremely unpopular, and he wants out so that he can say he ended the forever war, and brought our boys home, and to kind of satisfy the French public. So I think he has a chance to do that here, and that's really kind of what's behind this withdrawal. But as you said, there's been another coup in Mali back last year, there were mass protests for a number of reasons, economic, COVID-19, and things like that. And there was a mass civil movement, and then there was another military coup that kind of threw itself to the front, got rid of the democratically elected president, Keita, and created this interim government that has been in power since. And it was a kind of division between the military and the civilian groups, the kind of united opposition groups and protest groups that led the coup, that made the coup possible, I should say, and the military. And basically, there was this guy Assimi Goita, who was one of the masterminds of the August coup last year, then mounted a new coup back in May, that was because the civilian people in the government basically kind of tried to decrease the power of the military over the interim government. And he was like, no, 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 no. So he overthrew them, had them removed, and the international
And jail
community has
too, I
cried foul.
believe.
They didn't jail him. They arrested them and held them
Okay.
at a military camp for a couple of days, and then released them and just kind of said, forced them to resign, issue a resignation before they were released. They were released, and then they've just, as far as I know, gone on their merry way. But the reality is that the military has reasserted power over this interim government, and a lot of governments around, including France, have cried foul. West African governments have, in part, cut off their cooperation with the Malian government, and so on. So,
Right, and that's ECOWAS is the
yes.
acronym, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
the West African Economic Community is basically what it means. Yeah, I don't remember the
And
exact acronym.
that's the entity or coalition, if you will, that's cut Mali off. And at the same time, there's another coalition, I suppose you could say, that has all but recognized, if not recognized, the transitional government, as it's being called in Mali. I forget what the name of that coalition is and the acronym, but that group is also being isolated and chided by the international community, or at least those members of the international community involved in what's happening in Mali. But just to go back to Operation Barkhane and it ending, from what I understand, there will be French troops going home, but a lot of them will be dispersed throughout the Sahel, it seems, and joining what's known as the Takuba Task Force, which is something that's been active, I suppose you could say, in the region for a while now. Can you talk about that at all, as far as it's not going to be a complete withdrawal in the sense that all the troops are going home. There's going to be that disbursement, as I just mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know too much about what they're going to be doing after, as far as who they're going to be working with or what mission or whatever, but there are many missions in Africa. And you're right, some troops may be coming home, but the French presence in West Africa will not end. That's very much true. And of course, the French aren't the only ones there too. U.S. Africa Command is involved in training a lot of these militaries too. We know about the base in Niger from that was kind of brought to the national light by those four soldiers the U.S. soldiers who were killed a couple of years ago, and people were like, "Where's Niger? We have a base in Niger and whatever." And actually, we have a couple bases in Niger because Niger has 3 colossal uranium mines, which are mined by French companies. So there's a lot at stake there. I really can't speak about what the French troops are going to be doing after that. I haven't seen a ton about it, but you are right. They're not all coming home. They will continue their cooperation with these governments, which of course plays a dual role. It keeps the governments pliant to French interests. Countries like Chad and Mali and Niger and the Central African Republic and so on are kept, pliant neo-colonies where companies can extract colossal amounts of wealth for very cheap. Don't have to observe safety regulations, can often not, they don't even have to pay, like they can keep most of it for themselves. They pay only a very small amount of royalties. Like Chad exports $1 billion in oil each year, and they get 12 cents a gallon. 12 cents per dollar, excuse me, of oil, not 12 cents per gallon, 12 cents per dollar of oil that is extracted on a pipeline that pulls it out of their country, so that's only made possible by the fact that these pliant governments are kept in power by French forces, and the other European colonies do the same. Portuguese and the Portuguese colonies, the British and the British colonies, and so on.
And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of this has to do with class, if you will, or the bourgeoisie versus these, I suppose what you can consider the lumpen proletariat as far as the bourgeoisie aspect of this views them. So in that sense, it's the foreign businesses coming in under the cover of imperial militarism and exerting that class advantage, if you will, over the local people. And I think that's an aspect that gets missed a lot, is the class aspect of it, and the way that's inextricably tied to capitalism, as you mentioned earlier. And I think what's remarkable about what's happening in Africa is that we're seeing it play out not just in real time, but it's so flagrant, it's so blatant. But that's only if you know that something's happening there. So it's sort of like, what do they call not the Kachina dolls, but the Russian dolls, where it's like that. It's like one within another, within another, within another. So lots of layers to peel back there. And
well, that's one of the geniuses of neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism is the veneer. There is a veneer of autonomy, a veneer of independence, that kind of camouflages these workings, where you have these multinational corporations that have, Total is involved in Mozambique, Total is involved in Somalia, Total is involved in Central African Republic, or not Central African, Chad and Cameroon, but in each of those you have formally independent governments, and it can often, maybe they cooperate with a consortium. That pipeline I told you about was built by a combination of ExxonMobil, Total, Petronas, and like one other corporation, you know what I mean? But like, that's never going to get reported on, really. And when it does, it's never really kind of, the details of it are never explained. It's always, well, this is going to bring wealth to us or whatever. Okay, it'll bring a little fraction of wealth, but like, how much of that is being exported?
Right. And we saw something very similar in Nigeria with Shell, and the way Shell was, it's cliche, but it's true, plundering the Nigerian,
yes,
right, for the purposes of extracting oil. And we saw that the local people, that Nigerians were not kosher with that. They didn't cotton to that. And there were actually death squads hired by Shell, and there were activists who were executed. They were hanged, Ken Saro-Wiwa being perhaps the most well-known. So you talked about the legacy of this more toward the middle, getting into the latter part of the 20th century, but there are also, as I just mentioned, much more recent examples of neocolonial plunder. I suppose you could say. So it's not something new, and it's not something that occurred a long time ago and then there was a lapse and now it's back again. This has always been going on. It's expanding. And one of the countries you mentioned that's caught up in this expansion, if you will, is Mozambique. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little about what's going on there, because that gets, with talk about AFRICOM and what's happening in the Sahel and what's happening with France. There are the key players that are talked about, like Mali, for example, but there are, and I mean lesser players only in the coverage that they're given, but lesser players like Mozambique. So perhaps you can talk a bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, so in Mozambique, you have, think about where Mozambique is, kind of on the southern cone of Africa, northeast. It's kind of sandwiched between South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, and Eswatini, kind of in this little corner over there. And they were a Portuguese colony for almost 500 years. Really only kind of intensely colonized for beginning perhaps in the late 19th century, but they were always kind of claimed, at least along the coast, by the Portuguese. Recently, there have been discoveries of oil in the northern part, in a province called Cabo Delgado, which is on at the northern tip. It's kind of a long country, and the capital, Maputo, is down in the southwestern corner, and then Cabo Delgado is like 2,000 miles away at the other end on the Tanzanian border. And the discovery of oil there in particular, not oil, excuse me, natural gas, especially off the coast, has led to a rush by oil giants like Total and ExxonMobil. I think Petronas might be involved, to extract that. And what it's resulted in is a net $50 billion investment. It's the largest gas project in Africa, and to build this, and it involves offshore and onshore stations and such, and has really disrupted the life of this very poor section of Mozambique. This is where the revolution began in 1966. The Frelimo Liberation Front movement that eventually ousted the Portuguese colonial powers in the 1970s began in Cabo Delgado, and so there's the gas on the one hand. There's also ruby mining, and Mozambique actually produces most of the world's rubies, and there are also ruby mines, and they are also in Cabo Delgado and a couple of neighboring provinces too. But it's that same area, so very, very heavily, intensely exploited area. And a lot of the farmers and people there have really been pressed hard, especially by the expansion of mining and of the gas projects. And on top of that, this is also an area of the country where the Muslim minority lives. And so there's also feelings of like persecution, you don't care about what happens to us, and so on, alienation from the Christian majority. And so there's also this aspect to like growing connections between the Mozambican Muslim community and Saudi Arabia, and kind of the exporting of their kind of Wahhabist beliefs to the leadership of this Muslim community, and that has all kind of combined into this kind of vaguely Muslim identity-based revolt in the province, really by kind of some of the most disaffected and marginalized people. And it's not really a mass movement; it's a bunch of gangsters, basically, and they've supposedly declared their allegiance to Daesh, but there's really actually no demonstration of an actual connection to Daesh. at all. I think it's probably just an attention grab, and but it clouds people's judgment because they think, oh, Daesh, spreading in Africa, war on terror, they're everywhere kind of thing. And you get the rush for, we have to militarily intervene. Like, terrorism is the magic word, and it excuses all kinds of imperialist adventures. And so once they did that, that really got the attention of the West. And they began to talk about, like, well, should we send forces there? Should we do whatever? And the Mozambican military is incapable of dealing with this problem. One, because the government is dedicated to supporting this massive gas project by these foreign companies. And that's in part because the government has been forced to accept loans from the IMF, which have basically strip-mined its economy. The IMF, when it gives you a loan, forces you to restructure your government in what they call a pro-growth model, which is a neoliberal free market system. They demand ends to government subsidies, slashes to government payrolls, and such. And so the Mozambican military is incapable of being properly funded to fight this, this insurgency. And the Mozambican government is unwilling to do anything about the oil projects because it's dependent on them because it's bankrupt. And so you wind up with these mercenary groups who they hire, who then go up there and they have no ties to the people and they commit atrocities and such. You have the private mercenaries that are hired by Total and ExxonMobil to defend their gas concessions there from these people. They are also committing atrocities and stuff. And so you have this huge mess up there and this growing problem, and it is at risk of becoming a regional problem. And so the countries around have been talking for a while. The Southern African Development Community, SADC, decided today to commit to sending a standby force to Mozambique to help fight this insurgency, because now that they've called themselves terrorists, now that they call themselves Daesh, it's like now people can only see a military solution to this issue. Portugal is also in negotiations to send several thousand troops to Mozambique. The European Union is due to decide next month on its own rapid deployment force, which is another imperialist project of Borrell, who is the Joseph Borrell, who is the EU foreign policy chief, who is really pushing this idea of like a European army. This is his chance to really kind of push that. And so there is this kind of rush to intervene in Mozambique, and they're, in my opinion, this analyst's opinion, they're going about addressing it in the wrong way. But that's what's happening in Mozambique.
So how would you say, if you can make a comparison or put them side by side, the group or groups that are arising in Mozambique and those that have been operating in the Sahel for a while now? Boko Haram comes to mind. These groups seem to have, Boko Haram being an example, they seem to have more official, if not official, ties to Daesh. And it seems like what you're saying with regard to Mozambique is that it's more so disaffected and oppressed and marginalized Muslims who have come together and are fighting the way they've been fighting. And it's more of a local, homegrown development with regard to Mozambique than it is in parts of Africa where, as I mentioned, Boko Haram, for example, is operating, which these are more so foreign fighters who are coming in and basically fighting as part of these Wahhabist groups. Would you agree with that?
Well, I can't speak too much about Boko Haram, for example, but I mean, Nigeria has the same kind of divide that Mozambique does between Muslim ethnic groups and Christian ethnic groups, and followers of more traditional African religions. And there's always been that tension in that region for hundreds of years. In northern Nigeria are the Fula people, and a couple hundred years ago, the Fulani were launching crusades across West Africa to fight against non-believers, believers in kind of local animist or traditional religions, and they built great empires before the Europeans ever came that spanned that area. So there's a similar kind of divide in that too. I can't speak as far as the indigeneity of the fighters of Boko Haram or of their ideology. So I can't speak to that comparison. Mali, I think it's a mix. On the one hand, you have a lot of. I'm sorry about the glare, by the way. I don't know what is going on with my camera.
That's
It's
okay.
not particularly bright outside, but you're getting white out. So,
It's all good. It doesn't
but
look that bad from my end.
okay, it looks awful on my end. In Mali, you have the same. I think it's somewhat similar. Like you have this chaos, and there is obviously a Muslim radical element to it, but the reality is that in many of these communities, religion is just a much more powerful social force anyway, and is a marker of the community's identity and their coherency. And so when there is any kind of crisis, there's a tendency to kind of look to the religious structure as a way to kind of hold on to things. And so I think that there is a tendency, especially in the West, to see after September 11th, to see Muslim militias in Muslim communities, or maybe even ones who are motivated by a religious, fervor or identity, to see them as terrorists, no different from Al Qaeda or Daesh or the worst manifestations, the Taliban, that you can imagine. And I don't necessarily know that there's a direct connection there. There probably is some element to it. Maybe I know that there are some that there's. Well, no, I really can't say that for certain. So all I would say is just be cautious about assuming that just because it's commonly stated that a group is Daesh or Al Qaeda affiliated, don't paint with a broad brush. There are many myriad reasons that groups like these exist, and many of them are going to claim for a variety of reasons to be allied to ideologies, maybe for local clout, maybe to get attention, maybe because they think it feels cool, maybe because they honestly believe it, or but that doesn't mean that first of all, the thing about Daesh is that where is Daesh? You know what I mean? They have no territory. They have no basis of anything. They're an underground organization, and so they have the notion that they are this the new terrorist entity spread all around the world is just laughable. It's ridiculous, So it's just a racist oversimplification by the U.S. military and intelligence community that helps to feed the war on terror, helps to excuse U.S. forces being in a lot of places, in Somalia, in West Africa and Kenya and so on. And the real truth about why they're there comes out when the fights about pulling those troops begin, which is what the Pentagon's doing now, is they've shifted away from the war on terror and towards this great power confrontation with Russia and China. They've talked about pulling out most of the 6,000 or so U.S. troops who were deployed in U.S. Africa Command and sending them elsewhere. And the first thing that those commanders said was, well, Russia and China will come in and get influence in this region if we leave. They said that alongside Daesh will expand or whatever, but that's really the concern, is the idea that if U.S. troops are gone, then these nations will look to Russia or China for solutions, for partners in addressing their issues, for loans, for partners on projects or whatever. And the Belt and Road is already a big playing a major role in infrastructure in Africa. And I think that that would expand, if the U.S. were to pull out. It would also give these people a chance to settle their own issues, and we can't have that either.
Right. So one of the, or perhaps the theme that's been running through everything we've been talking about is colonialism and colonialism and the history of both of those in Africa. And I wanted to touch on something that happened recently with regard to Namibia and Germany, and the ghosts of Germany's colonization of Namibia in the early 1900s. Can you speak to what happened with regard to that recently?
Yeah, so let's go back to the history first. Sorry, I just got out of the shower a little while ago. Got to take care of my hair. And yeah, so Namibia. So Germany was, of course, a rising imperial power in the late 19th century, united in 1871, very much hoping to join the ranks of the other great powers. It became the largest power in Europe and the largest industrial power in Europe when it united. So, I think Wilhelm II spoke of England or Germany taking its place in the sun, right? And so when the European powers came to Berlin in 1884 to divide up, to lay down the groundwork for how they would divide up territories in Africa, which became known as the Scramble after. Contrary to popular belief, they didn't actually get out and start drawing lines at this conference. What they did was they agreed on a set of principles that would govern their spheres of influence and how they would make agreements with local African powers and so on, that set the basis for this rush that had really already begun by 1884. The Berlin Conference was to settle dispute over who controlled the Congo River Basin. And the rules they laid out for that wound up governing the rest of their scramble for Africa, and these brutal colonial wars that led to these conquests. They didn't just draw up the lines. There was European invasions of West Africa, of Central Africa, of Kenya and Tanzania and Madagascar and Namibia, and Germany grabbed this territory in Namibia, which is along the coast. It's north of South Africa. It's south of Angola, and began to settle it. And as they settled, they came in it's kind of a pretty arid region, but there is agriculture possible there, and there's a very important port there too. And so as they settled there, they came in conflict with the local African peoples who had lived there for a long time, herding and kind of living a not yet settled semi-nomadic lifestyle with their flocks, with their cattle, and their grazing lands were being seized up by European farmers, by German farmers, and there was a lot of racist laws that were passed, and so in 1904, these two of these peoples, the Herero and the Nama, revolted for slightly different reasons, but they soon became the same reason. And the Germans responded with an outright genocide. The German commander was a man named von Trotha, and he literally drove the Herero people into the desert, destroyed their access to water and stuff, and just left them there to die. And then the ones who survived were then put into brutal concentration camps where they were forced to labor and live, and many more of them died there. And so in all, perhaps 80% of the Herero and Nama people were killed by this, and by 1908. And it was a really appalling situation. And then as far as Namibia was concerned, Namibia became a British colony after World War I. They won World War I, took all of Germany's colonies away. And then it became administered by South Africa, and South Africa imposed its apartheid system on Namibia. And so you had the same system there. Namibia won its independence in the late in 1990, and because South Africa, as you'll remember, also got involved. They mounted an invasion of Angola to the north, where they were fought off by by Cuban soldiers, by Angolan, and they got support, from the Cubans and from the Soviets. So that ended South Africa's ability to impose its will on Namibia, where there was also a resistance movement being waged. And 4 years later, apartheid in South Africa fell as well. So it was this huge, huge anti-colonial victory, and that kind of all snowballed together. And so a lot of those colonial relationships, let me fast forward. So basically, for the last 5 years, Namibia has been pressing Germany to admit to having committed this genocide and to getting some kind of compensation for it. And those negotiations recently, were fruitful and led to this agreement for Germany to fund some development projects in Namibia. And they aren't issuing a formal apology because they won't admit to having committed a genocide under what the UN has defined it as, but they are basically kind of going to go there and apologize in some way.
But they refuse to call what they're doing reparations, from what I understand.
That's what it is. Yeah, because that has a technical legal name. So they're just like, we'll just fund some development projects and you'll understand it's because we're sorry. Now, it's a very small amount, when you consider what they did to this country.
About $1.3 billion.
Over 30 years.
Yeah.
It's an insultingly little amount. And most of that isn't probably going to go to the Herero or the Nama, the descendants of the people who were killed. And so they're very angry and they're protesting and are saying we deserve more. And even attacking their own government and saying y'all are complicit in this because the ruling party is composed of a different ethnic group who was not subjected to genocide. They were oppressed, of course, by the apartheid system, but they were not the ones driven into the desert. And so there's this attitude too of this genocide doesn't really matter to you. You weren't affected by it, whatever. So there's a lot of kind of hard feelings about that. But yeah, at the core of it is this kind of really, really small pittance of a deal. It's still remarkable that Germany has admitted to this.
Right.
But yeah, come on, the paper should be more than this.
Right. And I read an analysis or a perhaps prediction, I don't know what you want to call it, but that as far as the reparations go, that it's part and parcel of Germany trying to reconcile with its colonial past and perhaps other crimes it's committed abroad. And I'm wondering if there's anything you can speak to about that, because you said it's remarkable, and it is remarkable, even though it's a pittance that Germany is essentially tossing to Namibia. But is there anything you can say about the remarkability of what Germany's doing? Why it's such a rare occurrence, even nowadays?
Well, I mean, I think about Trudeau's comments about the genocide of Native people in Canada, and how he has tried to act as if that era is behind us, that genocide is over, that the crimes against Native people are done. And when I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago when he issued this apology and spoke about it in the past tense. And you had, First Nations and Metis and Inuit people coming out and saying, this is a joke. This is still ongoing. We need to talk about things that are still happening. Indigenous women being murdered. Oil pipelines being plotted across our lands. The Royal Mounted Police, behaving with impunity toward Native people. So there is this kind of attempt to look past it. In the United States, we do the same thing. We act like the era of anti-Black racism is behind us, the era of Native genocide is behind us, and so on. And it's obviously not. And so Germany is kind of doing the same thing. Germany is an interesting situation because, of course, that you had the Nazi era and the appalling things that they did to other Europeans, to Jews and to Slavs and Roma and all other groups, homosexuals, LGBTQ people, and many other groups, disabled people and so on, autistic people. And so after World War II, you had East Germany and West Germany, and they went about things very differently. In East Germany, they shot all the Nazis, and just kind of, East Germany paid reparations to the Soviet Union and then was rebuilt as a new society. And in West Germany, you had attacks on the legacy of Nazism, on an attempts to erase and ban the ideology while incorporating the former Nazis back into the West German government, banning the Communist Party, keeping the anti-gay laws in place and stuff like that. So there was a very, very different handling of that legacy. And of course, it was West Germany that ultimately wound up absorbing the East in 1990 and 1989 in what happened there with the end of socialism and whatever. But basically, like, the Federal Republic of Germany is the one that has continued. And the ways that they have, it's very, very strange. The ways that they have addressed the Shoah specifically has been to go all out in supporting Israel. There is an attitude of anti-Semitism in Germany that plays out as very, very strongly pro-Zionist, even among leftist groups who their parallels in other countries would be strongly supportive of the Palestinian struggle, are very, very pro-Israeli because of the idea that, like, establishing a Jewish state is like, and defending it and supporting it is kind of, what we owe the Jewish people because of what we did to them. And that's kind of been the way. Now, obviously, we know that Israel is a European outpost in the Middle East, and that's why Germany supports it. But that's the ideology.
An American outpost as well, I would argue.
What's that?
It's an American outpost as well.
Yes. I mean,
I would argue.
Yes, that's what I mean. A kind of Western outpost. So what's interesting is that the Namibians have been drawing parallels to how Germany handled the anti-Jewish genocide and how they are handling the Herero and Nama genocide, and the ways that the extent to which Germany has, the German government and German civil society groups and so on, have really gone to, like, talk to people who survived the concentration camps and affected communities, and really kind of to highlight that and fund that and support that and make that a major part of the ideology of, like, we're moving on from that, and how they have totally not done that with what happened in Namibia. And this deal was reached without speaking to representatives from the Herero and Nama. And so there's and certainly not the level of interest, the level of scholarship, the level of cultural bringing up of these people that we beat down for them. And they're saying it's racism, because Ashkenazim are white, have light skin, look like Europeans, and Herero and Nama don't. They are Black Africans. And I think they're right. I think there's a great deal to that. That's how the anti-Semitism was addressed in the United States too, right? Was saying, like, oh, we were wrong to say you weren't white before, but now we're willing to welcome you into whiteness. And kind of saying, like, that's where the wrong was, rather than saying that the concept of whiteness itself is what's wrong.
Right.
And so that's kind of the way that they've handled it. It's the same in Germany too. And so they're really kind of highlighting that disparity in the way that Germany has addressed its legacy. Because, and of course we know why too, because they aren't actually addressing the foundation of the roots of this. Germany is still an imperialist country. It is one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, and that wealth was gotten from the exploitation of its colonies, which included Namibia, which included Togo, which included Tanzania, a place where hundreds of thousands of Africans were massacred in colonial wars there too by many of the same commanders who massacred people in Namibia, in so-called German Southwest Africa. And that's not given the attention either. And then, of course, the wholesale exploitation of much of Europe that they engaged in during the Second World War, too. So all of that has never been remedied. That strip mining of those countries' wealth exists. And even in Namibia today, you have the descendants of the German settlers there still control 70% of agricultural land. They control the vast majority of the wealth in the country. And so those, even though formal apartheid is gone, the legacy of white supremacy persists. And that colonial relationship still exists. And so the ghosts of the colonial era are not even behind us, they're still with us.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point to make as we wrap up here, that yes, a lot of these atrocities occurred in the past in the colonial era, if you want to say that, but they're still reverberating today in very impactful and shocking and sometimes or oftentimes brutal ways. And it's important to have the historical context that you provided today, because otherwise it's as if we're hearing about these events, these genocides, for example, for the first time. And it shouldn't be that way. But as you said, there's a race, class divide, among many other divides that plays into it. So yeah, it's important to remember, I think, once again, that the echoes of these colonial conquests are still with us. We can still hear them. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. I really wanted to get an update on what's currently happening in the Sahel and what we just talked about historically, the recent developments. So I think that was a good arc that we traversed there. So I think that's a good place to leave it. Our guest today has been Morgan Artyukhina. They are a writer with Sputnik. You can find a lot of, or all of their pieces archived there, I believe, for Sputnik at least.
For Sputnik, yes.
Yeah. So Morgan, thanks again for joining us for another round of Facts on the Ground. And hopefully we can talk to you again.
It's my pleasure. As Frelimo says, a luta continua.
Which means, or translates to,
continues.
Right on. Okay, thanks, Morgan.
All right, bye.